All right, let's get started. All right, so in order to make up a bit of time, I'm listed on here as being the second talk in this session, but I think I'm going to compress mine and fold it into the after lunch just so we can get a little bit caught up, especially since your questions are so great and we want to fill in more of those. So to lead off this next session, we have Matt Kane. Matt writes for Puck++ for his own blog. He is for his day job, he's a risk management expert at the Bank of Montreal. He also claims to be last on his ball hockey team in Corsi Rel, which fits fine because my beer league save percentage lifetime is somewhere in the 600s. So I think we're doing just as well. So Matt is going to talk about, I have this right here, talk about shot location data, which is close to my heart, particularly when it comes to informing team and player strategy. So Matt, come on up.
Thank you. Is this working? I don't know. Can anyone hear me? Oh, it's go. Oh, right. You may want to actually put it up. Yeah. All right. There we go. I actually managed to pull my Corsi Rel up, but that was mostly because the rest of the team quit and we didn't have enough players for me to get off the ice. So as Andrew said, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about shot location data and how we can use it both from a strategy point of view and from a player evaluation point of view. So to give you a bit of background, the NHL has been collecting shot location data, basically the X and Y coordinates of each shot since the 2007-2008 season. And since the 2010-2011 season, they've also been collecting which players are on the ice. So the 5 defensive players, or the however many defensive skaters there are, and the 5 offensive skaters, as well as the shooter. Most of the analysis and work that's been done to date has looked at, how frequently shots go in from different parts of the ice. So the best example of this is obviously the Hextall graphs that are available on War on Ice that show in the scoring chance area, the home plate area, shots are way more likely to go in than, say, taking a shot from the outside hash marks. So I was hoping to sort of build off of that and look at 2 questions today. The first is, what other factors can we look at in terms of shooting percentage and shot location data that give us a bit more information about how likely a shot is to go in? And specifically, I'm going to look at the shooter's position, so whether it's a forward or a defenseman taking the shot, as well as the shooter's handedness, so whether a player is shooting from their on-hand or their off-hand. And the second question I wanted to look at is, what other factors or what other information can we get out of the shot location data other than where the shot's coming from? What can we infer from it, and how can we use it to come up with some new player evaluation metrics? So we're going to focus today on 5 versus 5 play and only on the data from 2010 to 2014, because that's where the on-ice data is available. So I'm going to start by going into raw shooting percentage data, and we're going to break it down. This graph is a lot of information, obviously, but the way I've set it up is to organize the shots by both forward and defenseman and by area of the ice. So the scoring chance area is the traditionally defined, if you took the goalie restricted zone and you went out to the hash marks and then up to the top of the circle, that home plate area where we know that shots are significantly more likely to go in. I've also broadly define another class of, or another area of the ice as the middle, which is just the area directly above the scoring chance area. So if you think about going from the face-off dots back to the blue line and on top of the circle, or on top of the face-off circles, that's the area we're talking about. And the last region that we're going to look at is the outer region. That's basically everything that's left over the outside of the rink, obviously not very likely to score from there. So the first thing that we can see looking at this data is that players tend to shoot better from their offhand. Their shooting percentage is higher when they're taking shots from their offhand. For forwards, they shoot about 9.9% from their offhand versus 8.6% from their onhand. And similarly for defensemen, we see that they're at about 4.8% from their offhand versus 4.1% from their onhand. What's interesting is that for forwards at least, the majority of this difference isn't driven from shots in the scoring chance area. It's mostly shots that are coming from the middle. So outside of that really high probability zone where we know that in general players are really likely to score, shooters on their offhand tend to shoot a lot better than shooters on their onhand. The other interesting thing is that in general, forwards tend to shoot better than defensemen, even after we correct for where they're shooting from on the ice. So a lot of, at least intuitively, you would think that the majority of the advantage that forwards have is that they tend to shoot from closer in, they tend to shoot from higher percentage areas. But what we see when we look at the data here is that no matter where they're shooting on the ice, they're simply better shooters. And some of that may be the fact that they're getting more shots on the rush. Some of it may be the fact that they're getting more shots before the whole defensive unit has a chance to set up. So defensemen may be taking more shots after the opposition has had a chance to get their system into to match up. But in general, forwards are putting the puck in the net at a higher rate no matter where they're shooting from. So the natural question from this is, should we just play everyone on their offhand? If they're going to shoot better, is that a legitimate strategy that a coach could take? And the answer, obviously, as it always is in hockey analytics, is we can't say for sure, not necessarily. Calculating shooting percentage doesn't really tell us the whole story. We need to know whether this increase in shooting percentage is offset potentially by a decrease in the number of shots that they're actually able to take, or an increase in the number of shots that the opponents are taking. If they're no good in the defensive zone on their offhand, then it kind of cancels out the effect of shooting at a higher rate. So in order to figure out, whether this is a legitimate strategy, we need to know how on-hand and off-hand players are doing from a possession point of view. So we're going to look at shots for rather than Corsi, just because we have the data there. But we also need a way to figure out when players are playing on their on-hand and when players are playing on their off-hand. It's really easy to watch the game and figure that out. A lot more difficult to pour through 4 seasons of data and to say, this defenseman's playing on the left side versus the right side. So how can we do that using the data that we actually had and to look at it on a league-wide basis? Well, the one way we can look at it is to calculate what I've called the player side bias. And this basically takes advantage of the fact that intuitively, players are going to shoot from the side of the ice that they're positioned on. So left wingers are going to take shots from the left side of the ice, right wingers are going to take shots from the right side of the ice, and similarly, defensemen are going to do the same thing. So if we take the total number of shots that a player takes from the left side of the ice, divide it by the total number of shots that the player takes in general, we can come up with a metric that gives us a sense as to what side of the ice they're playing on. And the most obvious example here is Alexander Ovechkin, who in 2012, 2013 managed to make both NHL All-Star teams as both a left wing and a right wing. And I think if you presented this graph, it may have been obvious to most people which season was the year he switched sides over. So you can see pretty clearly that in 2012, 2013, he started to take a lot more of his shots. Basically, almost 60% of his shots came from the right side of the ice. So how do we use this side bias data to figure out what side players are playing on? I'm going to focus primarily here on defensemen because we don't have to worry about centermen and we don't have to worry about classifying 3 people. So we're going to look at defensive pairings initially. And the first method we're going to use is that if a defensive pairing is playing on the ice together and we have enough data with them both on the ice together, we're going to look at what they did on the ice together. So if me and my partner, if I take 15 shots from the left and 3 shots from the right, my partner takes 15 shots from the right and 3 shots from the left, it's pretty safe to assume I'm the left defenseman, he's the right defenseman. So if we have enough data, if we have more than 10 shots, which admittedly a completely arbitrary number for each player, we're going to use that to figure out who's the left and right defenseman. If we don't, if players are only out there for a few shifts a year, if they're not really shooters, we're going to use their overall data. So we're going to look at, for their whole season, who tends to take more shots from the left and the right. So if we use that data to classify every defenseman, we can start to take a look at when we have split pairings or when we have one player playing on their offhand, do they perform worse? And what we see is that when we have opposite-handed pairings, essentially a left-handed player playing on the left side, a right-handed player playing on the right side, they tend to take about 50% of the shots, which is exactly what we would expect. Because we're looking at data in the aggregate, we should feel that everyone is going to be a neutral, as a whole, they're going to be a neutral possession team. What's interesting is that when we look at pairings which feature 2 left-shooting defensemen or 2 right-shooting defensemen, they actually only take about 49% of the shots when they're on the ice. So they're not playing as well from a possession point of view. And naturally, you would think that some of that is going to be the shot the shots against. Maybe they're not playing as well in their defensive zone. They can't handle playing on their offside. They can't reach out or whatever. But when we look at how the shots against actually split, if we look at, as a left defenseman playing on the right side of the ice, are the shots more likely to come from the right side of the ice? We see that that's not true. The split between left and right side is basically the same between the two groups. So what that implies is that it's likely on the offensive side of things that the issues are occurring. It may be that they're having trouble getting out of their own zone and generating shots. It may be that they're having trouble setting up when they're on their offhand. But for whatever reason, defensemen playing on their offhand tend to post a lower possession number than defensemen playing on their natural hand. The other way that we can use this new information that we've extracted from the shot location data, from the shot bias data, and from figuring out who's playing on what side is we can use it to evaluate defensive ability. So if we want to come up with a really crude model, we can divide the ice directly in half, and we can say whoever's playing on the left side, you're responsible for defending the left side of the ice. Whoever's playing on the right side, you're responsible for defending the right side of the ice. And we can find two ways to measure how well they're doing at defending their side of the ice. The first is to just look at what percentage of the shots come from a defenseman's side of the ice. So if I'm playing left defense, what percentage of the total shots against are coming from the side of the ice I'm defending? Anything less than 50% obviously means that relative to my partner, I'm preventing more shots than would be expected. Similarly, if we're over 50% relative to my partner, I'm not doing as good a job. I'm not really pulling my weight in the defensive zone. The second way we can look at it is we can start to take into account the shots for and the offensive contribution that a defenseman might be making. And we can calculate what's basically like an alternate or a modified shots for percentage. But rather than using all the shots against in calculating that percentage, we're just going to use a modified shots against from one side of the ice. So we're going to look at how many shots came from the left side of the ice, for example, and then we're going to multiply it basically by 2 in order to calculate our shots for percentage. So we can look at a relatively recent and relevant example, the Penguins defenseman from 2013 and 2014. And what we can see is that there's actually a fair amount of difference in what side of the ice the shots are coming for. If you look at someone like Bortuzzo, when he was on the ice, only 43% of the shots came from the side of the ice he was defending. On the other side of things, the departed Brooks Orpik allowed about 57% of the shots to come from his side of the ice. I'm not sure whether the Capitals are too happy with their purchase at this time. This may seem to indicate that they might have a bit of buyer's remorse. But if we start to take into account the offensive side of things as well and our alternate shots for percentage, we see that the players start to move around relative to each other as well. Paul Martin, who's actually second on the team in terms of shots for initially, when we modify it to look at how well he's defending his side of the ice, he actually becomes the best shots for player on the team last year. And not to pick on Brooks Orpik again, but he goes from the middle of the pack to being actually quite significantly the worst shots for percentage player on the team. So we do see that there is a difference in these metrics. They do tend to shift it around a bit. It's a little more nuanced. We do get the ability to, and it's, again, admittedly crude, evaluate a player's individual defensive contribution a little bit better. And the one thing that I haven't posted up here, but that I'll mention is that reducing the sample size here, only looking at the shots coming from one side of the ice, doesn't actually reduce the repeatability of this metric. So if we look at the correlation, if we take the 2-year period from 2010 to 2012 and the 2-year period from 2012 to 2014, the correlation in our alternate shots for metric is actually higher than the correlation for our shots for metric. They're about the same, but it's slightly higher for the alternate shots for metric. So even though we're reducing the amount of data we're using, we're still coming up with something that's a fairly repeatable metric and that we can use as an evaluative tool and as a predictive tool going forward. So to wrap it all up, to bring everything back together, we did see that players tend to shoot better on their offhand, and that as well, forwards tend to shoot better than defensemen, regardless where they're shooting on the ice from. We can use the shot location data, though, for more than just who's shooting from where. We can use it to figure out who's playing on the ice where, and that can allow us to, number one, discover that players playing on their offhand, or defensemen at least playing on their offhand, tend to post lower possession numbers or lower shots for percentage. And we can also use it to come up with a bit more of a nuanced view of defensive zone play and of who's preventing shots relative to their teammate better. One possible extension of this, obviously, is to start bringing forwards into the mix, start giving wingers responsibility for covering the points, for example, and seeing how the numbers change from that point of view. And obviously, the last thing is the hockey analytics cry. We need more data. The more data we have, the better we're going to get. If we can start factoring in misses and blocks, number one, we're going to be more accurate in terms of how we're evaluating how players are playing relative to each other, but we can also start saying, from shots to the left side of the ice, are you blocking more shots to the left side of the ice, or are you letting more through? So that is all I have, I believe. Any questions? Yes.
I'm just curious what you think about as far as the initial finding on players shooting better on their off wing. Do you think that it's perhaps because of a lot of those shots, or I guess most one-timers going off wing, but I think most of those are usually opportunities than one-timers?
Yeah, so the question was whether the fact that a lot of one-timers come from your off wing might be driving the results that we see in terms of players shooting better. And I think that's definitely probably what it is. Obviously, we don't have the data to say that conclusively, but given the fact that it is sort of a counterintuitive or something that we wouldn't necessarily think outright, I would say that that's likely what's driving it. Yes.
Jared, you thinking about same-handed pairs versus opposite-handed pairs. You mentioned that in figuring out whether a pair was same-handed or opposite-handed, if they play together or not, it's just a comparison of who was taking shots from one side. Doesn't that mean that any pair, I'm probably misunderstanding, pairs that play together enough will always be classified as opposite-handed? Am I understanding that correctly? And if so, might that be kind of skewing that kind of the pairs that play together less often, of course, have a lower shot percentage?
Sorry, no, not necessarily. So when I said that players who play together, how we're classifying them, if I have two left shots, we're using the data from where they're shooting to figure out which of those left-handed defensemen is playing on the right side of the ice. So it's not necessarily saying we're still using side bias data, but we're using the side bias from when they're on the ice together rather than their overall side bias. Yeah.
First off, I'm a Caps fan, so thanks for driving on that. It's terrible. In terms of the shooting percentage chart that you had up,
yeah.
Is there any data on like shots from the outside, how likely they are to create rebounds on chances from the inside or anything like that?
I didn't actually look into that. It is an interesting question, though. I don't have a great answer for you, though. Someone here may have looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's just data like rebounds or shots within 2 seconds.
Yes, yeah.
Another shot that's a higher probability. So I don't know, like shot rotation.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you've playing hockey, you're shooting your off lane, you don't have to move your away from the slot. So that makes sense. You would actually get more shots on goal from that angle. Secondly, you're shooting from your off lane, from your natural offside. That's harder for goalie to pick up. This is a case where the results pretty much show what you expect to see. They don't expect or is there an actual phenomenon going on?
I think it's difficult to say. The question was whether the shots from your offhand are representing a natural phenomena, or if there's something more, whether the goalie's having difficulty picking up the puck. I think that it's really difficult to say with the data that we have here. It's not something that you can go out and say, as I mentioned, take all of your shots from the offhand because they're more likely to go in. There's obviously a balance between generating shots for, and if you're passing up an opportunity to shoot on your on hand to try to get over to the other side of the ice, that's obviously not something that's advisable that any coach would ever go out and tell you to do. But it is something that, there's a lot of natural explanations for these things that may be showing up in the data here.
So, I mean, there's a trade-off, right? Because if you're a right-hander and you're playing the right wing, you're going to be better in your defensive zone. You're having easier time getting the puck out of the zone. You're also probably a little bit less likely to turn the puck over when you're skating into the offensive zone, right? Because
Yep.
you sort of protect the puck with your body. Have you thought at all or looked at that trade-off at all? Try to quantify it?
I haven't looked into it. I think that sort of comes up in the shots for percentage that we're seeing, where the shots are still coming for defensive pairings at least with the same frequency from the left and right side, whether we have a same-handed pair or an opposite-handed pair. What I suspect may be happening is that, like you said, players are having difficulty when they're on their offhand, getting out of the zone or getting into the opposition zone, and that may be suppressing the total number of shots that they're able to generate against the opponent. Yeah. Awesome.
I got to give Sam's introduction first because that's my job. Plus, I got to embarrass him a little bit, but it's his wedding night or anything, so I'll keep it easy. Sam, by the way, is getting married very soon to a lovely, lovely woman who I don't think is here today. So that I don't know if that ups or lowers or increase.
Sorry, ladies.
Yeah. But his patience with everything is legendary. Sam is a fifth-year PhD student here at Carnegie Mellon. He is also the undisputed winner of 3 of his own set up last pools for the let's see, it's the Super Bowl, Olympics, Olympic hockey. There were a couple of other ones. Sam is undisputed at that. That's the Stanley Cup pool that I washed out on because I picked St. Louis and San Jose in the first round.
I'm the gambler that Andrew was talking about.
So Sam is going to be previewing some exciting new research that he's been doing. I'll let him tell the full story, but let it be known that this is the first time this has been presented in open session ever. So if it's awesome, you can say, and it changes the whole field, you can say that you heard it here first.
Let's run the whole thing then. You zoom out a little.
Okay. Hello again. So I'm going to talk about something today that it's called zone transition times. And the short version is that I was inspired to create this sort of new statistic by watching Rob Scuderi play in the defensive zone. Okay, so I'm going to give the same spiel that I gave at the joint statistical meetings in August. So I'm a PhD candidate in stats here at CMU. At JSM, I sort of wanted to point out that there's sort of a stigma in the hockey analytics community that we're all nerds. And not that we're not nerds, but nerds can also we still do cool things, you know. So I play on the school's hockey teams, and I don't know, Andrew plays in the men's league, and I'm sure a lot of you here play hockey, right? So you're not just nerds, you go beyond that. So good job. I'm entering the job market this year. If there's any NHL teams in the audience, I'm just saying. And if you have questions, just reach out to me on Twitter. Okay, so at JSM this past August, I was talking about quantifying defensive ability. And so there's a few ways that this has been done sort of traditionally using just the data that the NHL provides us. So, in the past, we've used things like hits, block shots, face-offs won, penalty minutes, things like that, plus minus. So sort of the issue with using these as a measure of defensive ability is that they're not actually predictive of future outcomes, or I should say future positive outcomes, right? I mean, if you get a hit or if you have a blocked shot, that means that you didn't have the puck right before that, and that's bad. You want to have the puck as much as possible. And so what's been nice is recently people have sort of moved to these newer metrics that are predictive of positive outcomes. And so what we've been using recently is things like Corsi against or Fenwick against, goals against per 60. So we have these rate stats, right? So Fenwick against per 60. And we get a measure of sort of how often shots or shot attempts or goals occur against your team whenever you're on the ice. And then the other one is player usage. We can look at how does the coach feel about the players? He's starting them in the offensive zone. or the defensive zone. So these are sort of the metrics that are used now to evaluate defensive ability. And they're good because they are predictive of future positive outcomes, which is what we want. So I was thinking about this, and I thought, what else can we extract from this real-time scoring system data that the NHL provides us? So first, I just want to I don't think people actually know what this looks like. So this is the RTSS data. This is where it comes from. We have things like the score in the game, but what's nice is this is called the play-by-play file, and it says what happens at every point in time. If you look way on the right, it tells you what players are on the ice. If you look way on the, well, not way on the left, but like sort of towards the left, it tells you what event happened. So like a block shot, puck out of the play or something, face off. And then there's some information in the middle there that says, Getzlaf won the face off against Crosby in the neutral zone. And so, so there's a lot of good information there. And so one thing I want to point out is that something that I feel has sort of been underused by people doing hockey analytics is we have some zone information there that sort of isn't used very often. So it says, like, if you look at the first one, Getzlaf wins the face-off against Crosby. It happened in the neutral zone. There was a shot on goal by Crosby. It happened in the offensive zone. So it's all respect to the home team there. So I'm going to try to use this information to create sort of a new metric. But first, I'm going to tell a little story. So this is April 8th, 2014. Setting the scene here. I was teaching a lecture on Markov chains. So who knows what a Markov? I imagine the answer is not many people. Oh, okay, that's actually pretty good. Okay, so Markov chain. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details, but basically we're interested in looking at the changes between states. Okay, so we're looking at the transitions between states and sometimes how long it takes for those transitions to occur, or what the probability of those transitions to occur. A state is just an outcome of a random process. So we can think of a really simple, boring Markov chain as just like a sequence of coin flips, right? Where we're interested in, the states are heads and tails. The process looks like that: heads, tails, heads, whatever. And we're interested in those changes between the states' heads and tails, and if we can sort of extract any information out of them. So, I mean, in a sequence of coin flips, it's all just random, assuming you have a fair coin. And so you can't really extract any information about that. So it's a boring Markov chain. The next day, I was at Consol downtown, and I was watching the Red Wings play the Penguins. And I was sitting in my favorite seats, which are right above the net where the Penguins shoot twice. And it's the second period. I'm pretty sure it's the second period. And there's this sequence that happens where Detroit takes a shot on goal, and it's stopped, and the puck's sort of hanging there for a rebound. And Rob Scary clears it to the corner, which is good. We don't want the puck to be right in front of our goal, so we clear it to the corner. But then Detroit gains possession, and then they pass it back to the point, and another shot happens. And then Rob Scary clears to the corner. And then it goes back to the point, and then another shot happens. And this happened like 5 or 6 times. And I'm sitting there watching, and I'm like, man, like we should have a way to say that, is this good that he's clearing it to the corner, or is it bad? How can we sort of measure this? And so I was thinking about, just the location of the puck, like throughout the game. And I thought, we have this information about where the puck is, because we know where the events happen in the RTSS data, right? And I wonder if we look at those transitions between offensive zone to neutral zone to defensive zone, and all those different transitions, and try to extract some information out of there. So I sort of thought about the process of a hockey game as a Markov chain, where the process is what zone is the puck in. The states are offensive zone, neutral zone, defensive zone, and then the example is just the puck's moving from the offensive zone to the neutral zone to the defensive zone, and there's some times associated with each of these. It's in the offensive zone for 14 seconds, and then moves to the neutral zone for 2 seconds, and then it's back in the offensive zone, and we have all this information there, and we just have to use it. So I made up a little stat, and it's called ZTT, or it's called zone transition times. And all it is just the time that it takes to move the puck from one zone to another. And so there's a bunch of different types of ZTTs that you could have. You could have the zone transition time for offense to defense, which would just be the time it takes for you to move the puck out of the offensive zone and into the defensive zone. So that's bad, right? We want that time to be long. We want to keep the puck in our offensive zone as much as possible. And then the opposite, so defense to offense, right? So that's the amount of time it takes us to get it out of the defensive zone and into the offensive zone, right? So that's good. We want that to be short. That means we're good at defense. So I rigged up a little R script using our NHL scraper package, and I pulled this data and I analyzed it. So this is for the 2014-15 season. This was updated yesterday. I don't think it includes last night's games, but so this is sort of a picture of where these teams fall. So let me explain what these axes are, because it's a little bit confusing. ZTT forward is any transition that's moving towards your opponent's goal. Okay, so this is sort of how good are you on defense? How quickly are you getting the puck away from your own goal and towards the opponent's goal? And then ZTT backwards is the opposite, right? So it's any transition that goes towards your own goal. So from the opponent's goal towards your own goal. So this would be like if you had the puck in your offensive zone, how long does it take for the opponent to get it to into your defensive zone? So it's good to be up in that top left corner. That means you're good at offense and defense. You want to have a lower ZTT forward and a higher ZTT backwards. And then it's really bad to be in this bottom right corner. And so you can sort of just, I haven't really done a lot of like thinking about this and what it means in the context of these teams, but I'm sort of just putting it up here. I kind of want to get everyone's feedback. What do you think about these results? So we can talk about that. Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have an, like I said, I don't have an answer, but I'm just as baffled as you. I don't know. So, yeah.
Washington, bad offense, right in the middle of defense, like Washington, bad offense.
Yeah, I mean, Barry Trotz, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm saying like.
So there's just even strength too, so I don't know if that affects anything, but.
That it's not always going to make sense to the eye test, kind of to go off what Sean was talking about earlier, like maybe things that, it's utilizing the statistic as you're using it.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, the terms bad offense, good offense, I'm sort of it's not really what it is. It's really just the time it takes for the puck to move. That doesn't necessarily, just because it takes you longer to get out of the zone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're worse at defense. It's just sort of indicative of what's happening when you're in the defensive zone. So, what's that? Yeah, exactly. Sure. Oh, it's a very small sample. Yeah.
Obviously, the statistic would probably be more instructive over time.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, I was wondering if there's any way to extrapolate this with respect to the player, because you specifically mentioned Rob Scuderi, clearly in the corner, being picked up again, or is there some way to analyze whether certain players are better than others at getting the puck to the place where it can be clear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for players, so if you think about it for teams, it's really nice because the team is on the ice for the entire game. For the players, we sort of have to look inside of each one of their shifts and look for the transitions within a shift. So they happen much less frequently, but they do happen. And so we have that. This is all players in the NHL, which you obviously can't see anything that's happening in this graph. But I kind of wanted to keep this graph in the slide just because I like the shape of it. I don't know, like it's just, well, I mean, it sort of like has this sort of like 2D normal distribution to it, right? Where it's sort of centered around the league average and it gets less likely as you go out there. I don't know, so I just thought it was cool, but we're going to zoom in a little bit and look at just the Penguins. So again, thoughts on this? So one thing I want to point out here is we're saying that, Crosby is bad at defense. But is that actually true, or is there something else happening there? So one thing I sort of thought about is, Crosby's quality of competition is much higher than Marcel Gottsch, and so that's playing an effect. That's having an effect in here in terms of how we should judge players with this statistic. And so it might be nice to look at this in conjunction with quality of competition or quality of teammates or something like that. One more graph, and then I'm going to answer all of your questions. So just because, if you want to get any attention in fancy stats, you should always include something about Toronto. So here's Toronto presented without comment. Same sort of idea. You have So over here we have Kessel is way up there. Good offense, bad defense. So I mean, I don't know. Toronto people, what do you think? I don't know. But just just to sort of, I'll put these graphs back up here. But just to answer the questions that inevitably will be asked. So why is this not on War on Ice yet? So right now, the way I wrote it, it's very slow. So we're working on speeding it up. We're going to try to get it incorporated into the player tables, like for the season. It won't be like in the in-game file because that'll just slow things down way too much. The other reason is because we've been organizing this workshop. So you guys are taking up way too much of my time recently, and we have to end that. So everyone get out. Also, I have this dissertation thing that we're just sort of ignoring for now, and just going to work on hockey for now and not worry about it. But we are working on it, so you know, it'll be up eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later. But so I'm gonna put these graphs up again and field questions. So we'll start way in the back. Yeah, so there's a couple things at play. So if I go back and look at the RTSS data, we don't have the zone information at every point in time. We only have it when something happens, right? And so if you know the defense is carrying it up out of the defensive zone, and then they circle back or something and look for their D partner or something, that's not recorded in this data. So it's only looking at when something happens. That's without a doubt going to bias whatever numbers I get out of this using for ZTT. What would be nice is when we have this, you know, fingers crossed, when we get this like either the RFID tags or sort of the video tracking of players, then we could really look at this a lot more in depth. But for now, we're just stuck with the RTSS data, which is good for what it is, but we're sort of limited in the fact that we only have when events happen. Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah. Right. So for players, we're still counting it. So if they're on the ice before and after the face-off, we're counting it as one contiguous shift. If the player changes, say, so the puck is covered and the player leaves the ice, we're not counting that at all. Because we don't have information about the actual transition between the puck being in the defensive zone to it where it goes next, because the player leaves the ice, and so we can't really say if that player had an effect on the puck changing locations. Nilesh?
If you look at how the transition time might be affected by the zone start, so maybe start in the defensive zone, like, take you longer to get out as opposed to jumping in.
Right. Yeah. So he asked if I've looked at ZTT in conjunction with things like zone starts. So that's next on my plate. I haven't done it yet. But I'm betting that we're going to see some cool graphs of ZTT versus things like zone starts, and then also versus things like quality of competition, because you know, it just sort of makes sense. So one result that I didn't show on here was I did look at the correlation between zone transition time and Corsi percentage, and the correlation was about 50 or 60%. I can't remember exactly, but I have it written down somewhere. So that's sort of an interesting result too. So I think there was a question over here. Yeah.
This is just we may not even have an answer to this, but
probably not.
Would be great for those players' point, especially when they're close to the center. Based on some of the issues we're talking about, it sounds like you might not be in a position to calculate uncertainties, but are you working on that?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was about sort of the uncertainty in both locations and just in you know, that we don't have a lot of information about, you know, individual players changing zones. I haven't really thought about it too much yet. That's also in the works. I mean, you know, again, this is sort of in its infancy. As Andrew said, it's the first time I've shown it anywhere. I haven't even tweeted about it. I think I sent some cryptic tweets about it like not too long ago. I was like, "Oh, I found something cool." Yeah, you remember that. Yeah. So yeah, so all coming soon, hopefully. Sorry, I can't give a better answer than that yet.
So we noticed there are high end teams and low end teams. Let's say you're the New Jersey Devils, and you know you're not going to take any shots, and you're not going to allow any shots, so there's going to be less events basically captured. Isn't it more likely that like guys who are really good at offensive stats really have defense?
Yeah, so the question was about high event teams versus low event teams, and whether or not this ZTT is going to be influenced by that. And I'm betting the answer is yes. We'll find out when I start doing some more experiments with it, and we'll look at some plots of ZTT versus something like Corsi pace or Fenwick pace. But yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
This is currently showing defensive zone all the way to the offensive zone.
So this graph. So let's take ZTT forward, for example. It's showing any transition that's moving towards the opponent's goal. So it could be D to N, it could be N to O, it could be D to O. So there's multiple different things, but we can split it out between each of them. It's just there's much less information there because we only have like a 12-game season so far. I wanted to sort of incorporate everything and sort of get some more data in there. But yeah, it's a great question. So
how many data points appear in a game?
Oh, man. That's a good question. I don't have the answer. Yeah, so the question was how many of these transitions occur in a game? I don't know the answer exactly, but I mean, if you think about it for teams, I mean, how many events are there for an individual team in a game? Probably something about 100 or so. Yeah, so hopefully 99, right? 99 transitions between these states. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on if the scorer is recording that event. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm really bad at this. So the question was about whether like things like goalies playing the puck would affect ZTT. It sort of depends on the scorers, right? And so if the scorer is recording a dump in and then Brodeur playing the puck as a turnover, then yeah, we would have that extra information of what happened after that. But if they're not recording those events, then it's going to be hard to say for sure. But I'm sure that definitely has an effect on on the true zone transition time. Yeah, sure.
So I know this is like super raw, but I know this graph probably looks counterintuitive in a lot of ways. Did you get the chance to look at all like 2013, 2014 data where this is and if so, is that at all more intuitive?
Yeah, so I did look at 2013, 2014 for teams. It just takes insanely long to calculate for players. But for teams, I did look at it. What was cool is that I found that so ZTT was somewhat predictive of future. So I took like half the season, calculated the ZTT, and used that as a predictor for point percentage in the second half. And it did have some predictive value there. It wasn't like a ton, but it was some. And it also correlated with Corsi percentage pretty well. So for what it's worth. The question, by the way, was about, I don't even remember what the question was. What was the question again? You could figure it out based on what I answered. So how are we doing on time here? We'll probably take one more. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a flaw. I guess I would say the chances of no event happening while the puck's in the offensive zone down there would be pretty low. But you're absolutely right. I mean, since we're just looking at the time from the one event to the time to the next event, it's not really taking into account when the puck enters the offensive zone, and then maybe there's some time that goes by before something happens. So again, you could consider that a flaw. Hopefully, in the long run, those sort of even out for each team. But again, it's something that could be explored, just a little bit of further analysis. So I think Andrew's going to get food, which is good, right? So So right now, this is literally just the average amount of time. But so the plan eventually is to estimate the like individual player effects with a Markov chain. Yeah, so their effect on the transition probability between states. Yeah. This right here is only 5 on 5, but you could do whatever you wanted. Yeah. Okay. We're real short on time, so I'm going to end my own conversation and start a clap for myself. And then I'm going to introduce Steve Birch. So Steve's working on this with your brother, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is Steve and his brother, and so Steve is he's currently a writer at Sportsnet. He's also done some blogging in the past, and Steve's going to tell you about Delta Corsi, which is sort of controlling for context with Corsi. And you can work on getting this on. Thank you. I'm gonna work on your slide.
Oh, you should hit down like right before clicking. You want a slideshow it should? Yeah.
Actually, let me set up the. Where's screen share on here? This is why we had Andrew.
Yeah, he's in charge. Is that it? Yeah, there we go. Okay.
This is terrible. Okay.
All right, and then slideshow.
Is that class?
Okay, cool. Okay, thanks for having me. I made the 6.5-hour drive down from Toronto yesterday in traffic. It was very unpleasant, but got in at 11:30. I'm a little bit tired, but I'll live. So Delta Corsi, the idea here originally stems from observations I was making based on how we traditionally assess play. I mean, Sam just went through all of this stuff, so I can pretty much race through it, which is good from a time perspective. But really, I found wanting our assessment of defensive players. So about 2-3 years ago, I started to think about the fact that we've been shifting our understanding of how we assess players in many ways. We now use more rate statistics. We are much more focused on possession metrics like Corsi and Fenwick. And we also have started looking more at differentials and percentages when we're assessing players, which makes sense when you're comparing guys who play on different teams, different amounts of ice time, different positions. It's important to sort of normalize as much as we can. So as things have progressed, this has been going on for 7 years. I started writing about hockey and analytics about 8-9 years ago. So I've been looking at this stuff for a while. I know a lot of you are new to it, but I haven't been thinking about this for a brief amount of time. And a lot of this started to percolate through within the past 2 or 3 years. And one of the things that was coming up was that not all minutes and situations that players are finding themselves are created equal remotely. Guys get different zone starts, guys face different opposition, guys play with different line mates. And what you're seeing on the ice, in my opinion, was likely driven by those effects and those factors. So the problem we have in hockey in comparison to something like baseball, which was mentioned earlier, is we're not dealing with discrete events. We're dealing with a dynamic system. So pulling data out of the RTSS feeds is kind of important and accounting for as much as we can possibly going forward. So the things we can account for, the things that show up in the RTSS data, include zone starts, the amount of time various players are playing, the quality of teammates, which we're usually assessing based on the average Corsi rating of the players they're with, or the amount of time they're playing in a game. And then the quality of competition, which I will get to in a minute. That's kind of an interesting point, and I think it's worthy of more discussion. Face-off wins and losses. That comes up in almost every Hockey Night in Canada discussion. It's kind of bizarrely over-accounted for in many circles. I think in many people's view, face-off wins is the exact thing that we think of when we think of possession. That may or may not be as important as many people feel. And aging. We know how old everyone is. So that is something else we can take into account.
We can also think about score effects. We know that as the game score changes, teams play differently. We've all seen the team go up by a goal or two and then fall back into a defensive shell. And similarly, when teams are down by a goal or two, they start to press more heavily, especially as the game progresses. So those are things we can kind of think about, and time effects. Now, the reason I've separated these things apart is the top 6 I've accounted for in my model. The bottom 2 I have yet to. I plan on incorporating it, but I now currently have 3 different jobs and I don't have a lot of spare time. So I'm getting to as much as I can over time. And then I'd like to work towards incorporating more shot type and location data, similar to what Matt was talking about in his presentation. Obviously, there's information there that we can sort of use in assessing players. So the end goal here was really to try and control for as many of these factors as possible and eventually tease out individual player effects. So historically, we've eyeballed things. Using even the new data, what generally has happened is people have looked at, well, I can look up a guy's numbers in all of these different areas, and I can sort of roughly guesstimate how good he is in comparison to the other fields that we're talking about, the other metrics. So these are all the things we've talked about in the past. These come up a lot still, and this is sort of the current state of affairs. People use REL measures. So the difference between how things look when a guy is on the ice minus his teammates results when he's off the ice. People have used WOWY charts. Tom Tango did this in baseball. David Johnson has a website called stats.hockeyanalysis.com, and it provides WOWY charts where it shows you how the team performs with him on the ice and with his various teammates and without him on the ice. There are usage charts developed by Rob Bullman. We have aging trajectory data, or delta, how players change year over year, which was originally done in baseball by Tom Tango again. One of the things that was the sort of seed for my idea originally was something called the heavy lifter index, which was developed by Ryan Poplicek at Hockey Prospectus. And score adjusting is something that Eric Tulsky has done a lot of work on. And then Hextolly more recently from Andrew and Sam is something that's sort of factoring into what I've been looking at. So all of this, in my mind, is that the hardest thing for people to digest is that they don't have a single number to go to. If you looked at that list of all the different data points we have to consider when evaluating players, there's about 8 or 9 different things you have to look at. Some of them combine them in different ways, but the question becomes, what's best when? How much do I weight different factors? How do I consider these things in distinction or together? And how do they play together as a group? So some attempts have been made to do this. Michael Schuckers has developed Thor. That came up in the press a few years ago, and at the time was largely laughed out of the room because people couldn't imagine a situation where players like Sidney Crosby were not the most valuable player in the league, and guys like, I believe, Ryan Kennedy was highly valued. Sorry, Tyler Kennedy. Thank you. I'm not a Pittsburgh. I've got a Pittsburgh tie on, but I'm not a Penguins fan. As well as guys like, who am I thinking of? There's a few players, though, that popped up really high. Alex Steen was another one. He didn't have a lot of goals, but he was really good at possession, and that kind of thing threw people. They didn't understand how that could be factored in. More recently, Michael Parcati, who actually works on occasion with the Edmonton Oilers, and Matthew Pfeffer, who's a analytics guy that does junior hockey stuff, but also works for a company called Power Scout Hockey, which does video analysis, have done work around expected goals, which is based on probabilities in terms of shot locations in various events and shot types. A few years ago at Hockey Prospectus, Tom Awad had a stat called Delta SOT, which sort of died off. He wasn't doing a lot with it. He's brought it back recently. But basically, it's kind of like a shot attempt differential, like Corsi or Fenwick, that actually factors in the probabilities of shots going in. So dependent upon shot location, he was thinking about the likelihood of goals. And more recently, again, Andrew and Sam have got work going on something called goals above baseline, which is an attempt sort of at heading towards a wins above replacement stat. I didn't want to get into the goals for and against thing at my level. I was more worried about shot attempts, so I created Delta Corsi. Similar idea, but kind of worked out a bit differently. So I wanted to assess defenders better. I thought that defenders don't seem to have a massive impact on save or shooting percentage. Most of the things we've looked at show that they don't affect goaltender save percentage at a deep level or shooting percentage when they fire shots. That stuff seems to be fairly lucky most of the time. But defenders do seem to be able to repeatedly impact upon shot attempt differentials. So Fenwick and Corsi, there does seem to be an ability to suppress shots against and to generate shots for. And again, like I said, I initially patterned what I was doing after what Ryan Poplicek did with the heavy lifter index, where he was looking at quality of competition and a variety of factors and trying to weight them in an index. So he was trying to find who was playing the toughest minutes and who was having decent possession results as a final outcome. He was largely looking at forwards when he did this. I decided to apply my model to defensemen initially, but what I realized was I wasn't happy with the index values. I felt like I was pulling numbers out of my butt. There was no reason for me to pick the numbers. I was like, well, I think this is worth about this much, but I wasn't really certain about it. So that really shifted things towards a regression model. So what I've been doing is using multivariate regressions, incorporating all the various statistics to determine weights for each stat. So we know how much those different things are explaining when it comes to Corsi as an end result. So I eventually started using a multivariate linear regression model, which sounds fancy and is complicated, is not an easy thing to figure out quickly. That was one of the things my brother helped me more with. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota. But the results we got. So things that came out of the regression. Corsi for and Corsi against are very weakly correlated. Okay, the two stats do not explain each other. So the common conception out there that good offense is the best or defense is a good offense is kind of a misconception. It's very possible for teams to have a really high Corsi for and still have a high Corsi against. It doesn't automatically translate that if you're getting a lot of shot attempts, that you're going to give up fewer. That doesn't seem to hold true. The same is true for individual players. So realistically, what this meant to me was I need to separate the two and look at them individually. So as a result, I've regressed Corsi for and Corsi against as separate statistics. Position seems relevant. Forwards and defensemen impact Corsi for and Corsi against at different rates. Quality of team effects are very significant. If you think about the fact that you play with the same players game in and game out, you're going to have a lot of ice time with certain individual players. Quality of competition effects, on the other hand, over the course of a full season are marginal to non-existent, okay? This aligns with work that's been done by Eric Tulsky and David Johnson that basically shows in small samples, in individual games, or in the course of something like a playoff series where you're playing the same opposition regularly, you definitely should account for competition effects. But over the long term, over the course of a year, we can almost ignore them. They really don't make a major impact. I do account for them in my model, but the effects are very small. They're very, very small compared to the quality of a team, okay? Time on ice is a significant correlate to results. Coaches are generally giving their higher amounts of ice time to better players. That's kind of logical and goes without saying, but in the end, it was a significant factor in terms of assessing what we should expect from a given player. Zone starts matter. Guys who are starting in the offensive zone definitely generate more shots, and guys who start in the defensive zone definitely face more shot attempts against. Similarly, winning or losing a face-off is important, but a lot less so than people think. It's not the main driver of possession. Yearly team effects. I had a really hard time trying to tease out the impacts of coaching and systems, and there wasn't an easy model to do that with the data we have. So realistically, what I've tried to do is by assessing yearly team effects using dummy variables, basically, if you're on a team, I assign a value of 1, and if you're not on that team, you get a 0. I regress to assess basic general team effects year after year. So the issue there is that likely encapsulates a whole bunch of different impacts, be it coaching, systems, the average level of play of the team, and any other effects like even scorekeeper bias is likely lumped in there a bit. And age effects do seem to be present, but they're very hard to detect. So guys at the older end of the spectrum, there's definitely declines in their results, but it doesn't necessarily hold true for every player, and it isn't enough of a factor for me to necessarily give it large amounts of weight. So in the end, context seems to matter a lot. When you control for all of these events, expected Corsi explains what we observe on the ice to the tune of about 64 or 65%. So you can literally predict what the average player would attain with the minutes he's playing very closely just by running those numbers and seeing what the expected outcome would be. And that seems to hold true over the long term. I've used all 7 years of data we had coming up into this season. So this is the graph of expected Corsi, which is the bottom axis, versus the observed Corsi, which is my y-axis. The correlation is shown in the top left, the R squared. So that's the percentage roughly of the observed Corsi that is explained by the expected Corsi. I have 2 points highlighted and they didn't translate through on the graph very well. The 7.99 point, that point represents Patrice Bergeron from last season, okay? So D Corsi, just to be very specific here, is the residual. It's the difference between what we observe and what we expect using the regression. So the regression line is that black line you see running through the middle of the data set, and the individual points are individual player seasons. So anything above the line, good season. Anything below the line, bad season. It's pretty black and white in that regard. But you can see there's a lot of clustering around the middle. So realistically, most players' seasons fall within a single standard deviation, as would make sense. And in general terms, you wouldn't necessarily call a guy a good or a bad player on the basis of 1 year. But we can look at multiple years of data and see if they're consistently producing these results. Patrice Bergeron over the past 7 years is by far the most consistent and most impactful player from a possession standpoint in the NHL. There's a stat I've created called D-Corsi impact, which basically multiplies the player's normalized effect by their ice time. And his numbers are sort of off the charts good. He's only had 1 year that he wasn't in, and that was because of his concussion issues. He's been a positive player almost every year other than his rookie season. And he led the entire NHL in D-Corsi last season. The other point that is highlighted here is Mark Giordano from the Calgary Flames. So that was unintentional. Mark Giordano last year only played he played less than 60 games. And there was numerous discussion amongst the analytics community that he likely deserved a nod for the Norris. He did not finish first in Norris voting. He had a high number of points, but again, his results were off the charts good. And even when you account for the fact that he only played, I think it was 56 games last year, his overall impact based on his ice time and the quality of play he was providing in terms of driving possession was phenomenal. It was astronomical. He was basically the second or third highest ranked player in the league last year, even though he played less than 60 games. Had he played a full season at that same level, it's quite likely he would have had the largest impact. So his season last year was amazing, and it's actually so far seems like it's continuing into this season. So again, just to clarify, it's the residual or differential between the player's observed Corsi and their expected Corsi results. Now, one of the problems here is you can't actually say with 100% certainty that what we're observing is actually a result of skill on the part of the player. Some of what we are observing is noise. So all you can really say is over time, if these results persist, that we should have an idea that the player is above or below average. In my perspective, this is an improvement on Corsi rel stats or rel stats in general, largely because it takes the whole off-ice thing out of account. You're largely focusing on various effects and impacts based on the on-ice data, what's happening while the guy is actually playing the game. And while there is some off-ice stuff included there, it's minimal in comparison. The last question here is it meaningful or reliable? People are fond of quoting players' shooting percentage and save percentage statistics. We tend to think of good shooters as guys that have a career shooting percentage that's certainly above the norm, or a goaltender that repeatedly puts up good save percentage numbers as a solid goaltender. Save percentage year over year for goalies that play 500 minutes only has an R-squared of 0.004171. In other words, a previous year's save percentage explains less than 1% of what you would expect the next year. Delta Corsi is around 15%. So there's definitely more repeatable in Delta Corsi than there is in shooting percentage or save percentage. So if people are going to continue to quote those other numbers, I see no reason why they wouldn't be happy to quote D Corsi in terms of repeatability. It also accounts for yearly team effects. So even though players switch teams, that's taken into effect by the yearly team factors. So even players who are switching from one team to another, those effects are still repeatable. You should still see the improvement or poor play show up in D Corsi. And there's also, I actually checked into coaching effects. So basically the persistence of expected Corsi versus the results we're observing in Delta Corsi. So what we see over time is there's a very slight negative correlation. So basically as a player's observed Corsi, expected Corsi shifts, coaches change their usage of players. So as a player starts to play better, there is a very slight shift in their usage. Their expected Corsi tends to become more difficult if they're showing better possession results. And similarly, if they start to play more poorly, we see a slight shift where they're given easier minutes. The one comment I made when I actually wrote a more formal paper on this would be that the shift is not drastic enough. Coaches seem to be very set in their ways, and they tend to keep throwing guys out there in the exact same minutes and the exact same usage that they have traditionally. Pittsburgh fans thinking of Brooks Orpik before he left town, after the numbers consistently showed that he's not doing a great job, him seeing all the toughest minutes over and over again doesn't make a lot of sense. The same could go for a player like Rob Scuderi. So there's definitely biases where coaches sort of stick a player in a certain mold and a certain mindset, and they keep consistently using them in that way, whether or not it's being effective. Thank you. I will take questions. The last thing I just want to throw up here is there are 2 Tableau visualizations that I've made available publicly that let you actually see, you can actually rate individual players. So I'll just show this quickly. So you can type in a player's name on the search. This is Justin Williams' 7-year career of the LA Kings. The middle chart on the bottom, the green line, represents his Delta Corsi. The left-hand chart is his Delta Corsi 4, so how many events he's generating above expectation. And the right-hand side is Delta Corsi against. It's how many events he's allowing versus expectation. So the center bottom chart is really what you should be looking at. And you can see by Justin Williams' chart, he's been above expectation every single year. So that leads to a lot of the Kings' success with him on the ice. Okay, so any questions? Yes. Okay, so the question was, have I looked at anything relating to how coaches ease players back into play versus in terms of their usage over time? Unfortunately, I haven't gotten to that granularity in terms of the data set. It is quite possible that that's what's happening game to game. So it is something I could probably tease out of the data if I looked at that specifically. One of the hardest things actually with injury data is actually getting a list of injuries from the NHL. It's not easily available data. So compiling that data set is challenging. I've tried to do it in the past. But yes, I'm sure you could look at that. And there may be an effect there. I honestly can't say. Anyone else? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, I've looked at team effects. Have I looked at coaching effects in specific? This summer, I actually did apply a coaching effects model to the regression. The biggest issue with team effects and coach effects seems to be that it really gets hard to assess coaches as separate from their teams if they haven't ever switched teams. And since we only have 7 years of data, many of the best coaches have been with the same teams for extended periods of time. If you think of Joel Quenneville, he's been with Chicago for the past 6 years. Mike Babcock has been in Detroit for the past 7. Claude Julien has been in Boston for the past 7. So a lot of the guys that are generally considered to be very good coaches haven't moved around a lot. So it's a very challenging thing. And what I ended up finding was the coach effects couldn't easily be discerned. So the effects were minimal, and they weren't in a direction that made logical sense necessarily. So I decided at this point to still exclude them from the model. There are ways to look at it, but again, it's a time issue for me so far. But yes, it's definitely something I've taken a look at. Yep.
I'm curious about the decision control for age and timeline. It seems like control for age, you're taking away from someone that is like providing value to the team, but someone who's providing value to given their age.
Right. Right. Okay. So the questions regarding accounting for or not accounting for age to assess for the effects of age and whether or not we should be doing that. 2 things I would say. One is the effects of the age in the model are actually very small. So I don't think they're making a huge impact in terms of the outcome. The second highest player rated last year as a forward was Joe Thornton. So the age effect doesn't seem to be a significant factor in the end. I have looked at models with and without age as a factor. It doesn't seem to change things very much either way. Okay. Anything else? Yep. Any other questions? Yep, sure. Yep.
We're gonna during the lunch break, we're gonna share all the slides on the blog. You can go check it out. I'm assuming everybody has seen the tweeted picture of the pizza waiting outside. All right, we're gonna break now. We're gonna reconvene at 2:30. What? All right.